My friend passed away recently because we couldn't figure out his blood type in time. He kept shouting, "Be positive," but it's been really hard without him. What's going on, YouTube? Today's going to be an instructional video because we're going to break down all the ways that you can interpret if a set is good for you. Anytime a new set comes out, you peruse an old one, or as nerfs and buffs occur, you can then have the knowledge to know, is this going to be good for me? Especially in the three main categories that we're going to be looking at, which are PvP utilization, PvE utilization, and then we're also going to be looking at solo play. Now, what's the difference between PvE and solo content? Well, there's a big difference. PvE is your main concepts of tanking, healing, and DPS, and solo is you being an individual player or an individual build that can kind of do a jack of all trades type thing. Very different than trying to do any of the traditional PvE things or from doing any of the traditional PvP things. So we're going to break them down into those three main categories and explain a lot of concepts in this video with chapters below. And before we jump into it, just because I try to not have very long intros, just as a reminder to subscribe and hit the like button, and let's get started. Now, to start off, we're going to break down some concepts. The first one we're going to break down is procking. Now, a lot of people don't know what a proc is, and it's very easy once you understand what a proc is and why you may want to use them or why you may not want to use them. What is a proc? Well, imagine in coding you have an if-then statement. So I pulled up the perfect example. Clever Alchemist. When you drink a potion during combat, you gain 589 weapon and spell damage for 20 seconds. If you drink a potion, then you gain this. It's actually just that simple. Proc sets usually give you more reward. You can see here we gain 589 weapon and spell damage, and the reason for that is because we are having to do something to gain a reward. Now, oftentimes you see proc sets used across all different types of content, and the reason for that being is that proc sets are usually good because the devs realize that if you have to kind of do some sort of condition statement, then you should get a higher reward versus if you're just looking at a set such as Claws of the Forest, which just gives you more crit to your class-based abilities. So because of that, oftentimes when we're looking at sets, if it has a proc ability, it usually will give you more reward. But there's a couple things that you still need to consider, even if you are getting a... The first one being is, what is the cooldown? Now, Clever Alchemist is interesting, and this is why I love it as an example, is you may say, Jake, there's no cooldown. That's fantastic. Well, hold on a second. How often can you drink a potion? Just because something doesn't have a cooldown necessarily written in the text doesn't mean that there's not a cooldown built in. And other things may be cooldowns of things that you're waiting to happen, such as every time you take damage. You generally don't always have control when you're about to take damage. So even if there are no cooldowns, sometimes you still have to factor in that if you're going to get your proc, you still may have to kind of finagle some things to make sure that you're getting it. Proc sets generally are more advantageous, and they usually do benefit quite a few different type of PvP playstyles and PvE playstyles. Solo content to a lesser extent, but a lot of solo builds that we're going to talk about later today focus on things such as heavy attacking, light attacking, and we're going to break down why that is. Those are oftentimes still proc sets, but usually when it comes to PvP and you're building in, you generally want to have proc sets that you feel comfortable procking. And Clever Alchemist is my favorite go-to example. It's been an A-tier set for PvP probably now for 2, 3, almost 4 years since it's been released. Just because it's so easy to use, it gives you health, which you need for PvP. And the beautiful thing is it also builds good habits. You generally want to continually be drinking potions throughout conflict. Yes, it's a bit of an economic sink for you, but that's why this is a good example, is it's building you a better habit. Let's talk about some other concepts and why you may want to look at other things inside of a 5-piece set and a 2-piece set. We're going to talk about those too. And that is Armor Master. Now, if you know the concept that I'm about to break down for you, well, you are just A ahead of me. But if you're wondering why Armor Master is the next example of a set that we're looking at, it's 5-piece. While you have an armor ability slotted, your max health is increased by 5%. When you use an armor ability while in combat, you increase your physical and spell resistance by 5180 for 10 seconds. Notably, also, no cooldown. Also, this is another cool concept that we get to break in because you can actually backbar this. Now you're thinking, Jake, what does that mean? Well, let's say you have three pieces on your front bar, you've got the weapons on your back bar, so you switch to your back bar, you utilize that armor ability, which say you're using annulment, then you can gain access to this physical and spell resistance increase of 5180 for 10 seconds. You get swap back of that front bar of yours, and you'll take that buff back to the front bar. This is important for two reasons. One is it allows you to basically build in something extra on your front bar. Now it's a perfect way to build in something like an arena weapon or a monster set or really anything that you think would be helpful. Another really important thing that this set gives us a perfect example of is this gives us what's called an unnamed buff. Now, unnamed buffs are very important because for those of you who don't know, there's tons of buffs in the game. Tons of them. But here's the thing that people don't know oftentimes is that you can't stack the same buff. You can stack the major and the minor, but those are different buffs. You can't stack two of the same major buff together. And oftentimes you're going to find yourself with competitive buffs that you will get through multiple different sources, and that can be pretty wasteful. And especially when you're building in different types of sets, you want to make sure that you're not building in a buff that you already have, because oftentimes, especially if you're using an Oaken Soul build for solo, you're getting tons of buffs. You want to make sure that you're not using your 5-piece sets or your monster set. Get a buff that you already have. Here is a perfect example of this because oftentimes I see lots of people suggesting Mighty Chuden, especially for solo builds. If you are like me and you're a sorcerer and you find yourself using Hurricane quite often because Hurricane is great for solo play because it gives you minor expedition, but you'll also note too that it gives you major resolve, meaning that your Mighty Chuden piece actually doesn't really give you as much as you think it did. There are other benefits that you'll be getting from this, such as the one-piece 1487 armor and the health, but you will not be getting any benefit from your major resolve, which is very notable because that really devalues how valuable it is. Now, there are other options you would have here. You could utilize this as a chance to rebuild your slots on your skill bar, or you could say, is Mighty Chuden right for me? But since we're talking about monster sets, let's break down another fun little concept because monster sets are one of the only sets in the game, don't worry, we'll talk about the other ones, that give you a one-piece bonus. Why is that important? Well, if you're using a mythic, there's a good chance that you're only going to use a mythic, a one-piece, and then two 5-piece sets. Meaning that you probably want to have a good one piece. And for example, for PvP, I have always been a fan of Swarm Mother for Magicka-based builds because you're getting access to a lot of stamina and a lot of Magicka. But notably, the Swarm Mother 2-piece is not very good. So you'll find yourself sometimes looking at these and thinking, that 2-piece is not very good, but on my PvP build or your solo builds, because you got to remember, if you're using the Oaken Soul Ring for a solo build, you're going to have access to a free one-piece slot. What monster set should I be using on there? Which is oftentimes why Slime Crawl sees quite a lot of utilization, even though its 2-piece of Gain Minor Berserk can usually be found through other means. Its 771 crit chance is actually the highest crit chance that you can get from any single one-piece monster set. And so as we look at the Oaken Soul Ring, it's just important to consider all of the buffs that you're getting. So, for example, as you see things like Major Prophecy, there's already a lot of places you're going to gain basically those same buffs. You'll also see on here Major Resolve, which we've talked about. So even though a lot of people suggest Mighty Chuden, I do think that there are better ways that you can get just the health and the armor that it's giving to you as its 2-piece. Some other good sets to know are Trainee. Trainee is one of the only sets that gives you a 1-piece bonus, as well as a 2 and a 3-piece bonus, which are notably health, magicka, and stamina. And 1458 is quite a lot. Druid's Curse is also one of the ones that does it as well. So Druid's Braid, the set, will also give you access to health, maximum magicka, maximum stamina, and then it repeats and it increases as you go down. Notably, I just want to point out, though, that the 1 and 2-piece and 3-piece of Trainee is higher, and you don't see those high numbers until you get to the 5, 6, and 7 slots for Druids. But if you wanted to, for example, let's say you've got 2 extra pieces and you don't want to run a monster set, I've seen a lot of people for PvP, they'll run a 1-piece Trainee, 1-piece Druid. Let's say they're running an arena weapon, a mythic, and 2 one pieces, and then a 5 piece, getting 2 1 slots of health is actually quite a bit of health because usually you want to have at least 30k health when you go into PvP. It's a bit niche, obviously, as some of the things that we talk about are not going to be mainstream sets. In fact, as we do this video, I'm already brainstorming how I'm going to do my set meta builds. We're going to actually have a meta report for both PvP, PvE, and solo. We're going to either do it effective of update 44 or maybe just before, because some of the patches and things are a bit kind of up in the air still as to what's being nerfed. But I want to try to get the information out as to these are the meta sets, because this is more of the overview as to how do you know if it's good for what you want to do. And that's going to lead us into the segue of, well, how do you know if it's good for solo content? And what better way to start the solo section than by breaking down why its best notable marquee set is its best notable marquee set? Not the Oaken Soul Ring. Everybody knows why that one's good. It gives you like every buff in the game. Sergeant's Mail, though, is unique. So its 2, 3, and 4 are health, health recovery, and weapon and spell. And this is a good kind of time to talk briefly about 2, 3s, and 4s. Generally, 2, 3s, and 4s can be effective in determining if a set's actually going to be good. Because, for example, there are plenty of sets, especially for PvP, that they would be so much better if they're 2, 3, and 4s. We're not doing all sorts of random gobbledygook. For example, health recovery is almost worthless inside of PvP. Just something to consider as you look at new sets. Different stats are more valuable for different types of content. And we're going to break those down as which stats are the most important as we talk about each individual one. We are on solo. Let's talk about solo. So the 5-piece, when you deal damage with a heavy attack, you gain a stack of Surgeon's Focus for 5 seconds, increasing the damage of your heavy attacks by 645 per stack. This effect can occur once every second and stacks up to 4 times. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, because it's a good question, why are heavy and light attacks so notable for solo play? And the answer might actually surprise you, but it may not. And that is because a lot of people assume that it's just easier to pilot a heavy and light attack build. And that's certainly true. But the other thing too is that you may get into long drawn out fights with things like world bosses, other types of roaming bosses. You may be in the Imperial City where you're constantly fighting, tons of enemies at once. Infinite Archive builds, for example, as well. Arena builds. Oftentimes, you don't want to have to be relying on a set build that requires you to have low stamina, low magicka. If you're constantly using a bunch of abilities and you're not getting any synergies from any of your allies or teammates or any sort of sets that pair with them to give you your recoveries back or any resources back, you potentially could be in a bit of a war of attrition, and you don't want to be in those situations as a solo player. So heavy and light attacking is the perfect way to combat that, because you're always in a situation where you have attacks that don't require any resources, in fact, to give you resources back. People also love the Noble Duelist Silks, which is another dungeon set from Blessed Crucible. And this one actually has pretty good 2, 3, and 4 because it gives you 2 lines of weapon and spell and a bit of stamina recovery, which admittedly doesn't really help. But when you deal damage with a light or a heavy attack in melee range, notably that's important, you increase the damage of your light and heavy attacks against monsters by 2,110 damage for 15 seconds. This can occur once every 12 seconds. When you look at sets like these, you can start to think, as a solo player, what exactly is going to go well with my Sergeant's Mail? And depending on the type of content that you're doing, this is a pretty good one to do. And I would actually encourage people to compare these two together, especially if they find themselves doing content that has a lot of single target damage. What is single target damage? Well, if you're attacking one person in front of you, single target damage. Now, if you're fighting tons of mobs, let's say you're trying to do an arena build, you may want to try to use something that's a little bit more conducive with a little bit of AoE, but you could always build that into your monster set, arena weapon, or something else as well. Because back in the old days, Ice Heart used to be the marquee set for solo content. It gives you crit chance, but then when you deal critical damage, you have a 20% chance to gain a damage shield that absorbs 5,000 damage. While the damage shield holds, you also deal some frost damage to the enemies around you, and this can actually occur very frequently. This can occur once every 6 seconds. That's pretty high as an uptime. So this is actually one of the OG arena builds. Now, some of the other mythics have kind of pushed Ice Heart to the side. Notably, the Pale Order ring people argue is a better version of Iceheart, but Iceheart, also from Dire Frost Keep, is a kind of base game set, meaning that you can get this very early on in the game and it can be a great build for you. Because at the end of the day, too, you're also probably playing without a healer. And sets like these can be good because they give you a damage shield, they deal damage to enemies around you, and they also, importantly, keep your health above 0, which is pretty essential as a solo player because you don't have anybody to resurrect you. Another OG set that people may want to consider is from Spindle Clutch 2, Bloodspawn. When you take damage, you have a 6% chance to generate 13 ultimate and increase your physical and spell resistance by 37-31, unnamed buff, for 5 seconds. This can occur once every 5 seconds. This effect used to be so powerful, because it was nerfed a little bit, that every set, every class used this for both PvP and PvE content. So if you were killing players or killing mobs, you were probably using this set because that's how busted it was. These days, it's definitely been nerfed, but coming from Spindle Clutch 2, this is actually a pretty good set to use for solo players. And the reason that I wanted to highlight this one as well is that ultimates are also really good, regardless of the type of content that you're doing. And a lot of times, how you may build a solo character can be pretty interesting. Physical and spell resistance are not usually very important for DPS to have unless they're doing, Infinite Archive 2-man content. And even in 4-man content, it really starts to go by the wayside. But if you're a solo player, having a little bit of extra resistance is actually pretty helpful. So that's what makes solo so unique, is that they do want to do lots of damage, usually through their light and heavy attacks. And things like weapon and spell and crit are very important to them, but also are things like resistances and health, which puts them in a very unique position. So if you're analyzing a set, is it good for you when you're a solo player? Think about things like your rotation, heavy attacks, light attacks. Think to yourself, is this going to give me any more survivability? Because you may need that depending on the type of content that you're doing. Is this going to be easily kind of woven into the build that I have? Will I have enough resources to maintain what I am currently doing? The answer is probably yes, but these are the questions that you may want to have. Because, for example, one of the best in slot DPS sets, Visai, requires you to have low magicka to get its best proc, meaning that that's probably not going to be a very good solo set, even though it's one of the best DPS sets. And for those of you who've never seen it before, this is Perfected Visai, which is notably one of the best DPS sets in the game because it increases your damage to non-player enemies by up to 12%. This used to actually be significantly higher, based on your missing magicka. Now, you could see why this is a great set. It's unnamed. We've talked about that. It also pairs with some other really good buffs that you probably don't have from other sources. It gives you crit chance. It gives you weapon and spell. These are important stats to have. But if you're a solo player, you want to keep yourself at low magicka at all times, that could be really difficult. And because of that, it could be putting you in a bit of a war of attrition that you may not want to be in. Now, you certainly could try to use a set like this and keep yourself near low magicka, and then by using heavy attacks to kind of keep yourself hovering around there. But usually, there's just better alternatives to build in, so that way you don't have to worry about that. That's what makes DPS in a PvE perspective so different and unique. Which is now our segue into PvE DPS. And to give a perfect example of this, we have Order's Wrath, which is a nice cookie cutter. Go out and get this set if you're a brand new player. It's craftable, it's cheap, and anybody can pretty much make it for you. And it gives you crit damage and crit chance, weapon and spell, and also increases your crit healing just for funsies. Why is this such a good set compared to a lot of the solo sets? Well, notably, this is good because crit damage is generally more important for PvE content as a DPS versus that solo type content. Why exactly is that? And what are the main differences truly between a lot of the different types of PvE content? Well, the biggest one is that if you're doing a lot of, trial content, the odds of you taking a lot of damage are pretty slim. The other thing too is that you're getting tons of buffs from your allies, meaning that you don't have to worry about stacking all these buffs yourself. For example, if you're using the Oaken Soul Ring, you may have healers, tanks, other people giving you all these named buffs, and well, you are not getting any extra benefit, meaning that if you had actually built in a lot of crit damage and a lot of unnamed buffs that deal a lot more damage, you would actually be doing significantly more damage output than you are right now. This is not to say that heavy attack builds are not good for trial content, because they can still definitely be used. But if you're looking at the high tier damage output, you're going to find a lot of sets that are very specific to crit damage and increasing your damage overall. But to give an example though of one that's not always true, we have Zens. Now, when you light attack, you apply a touch of Zens on an enemy for 20 seconds. Enemies with a touch of Zen take an additional 1% more damage for each damage over time effect you've applied to them, up to 5%. You can only receive the benefit of one touch of Zens per enemy, meaning that you can have one person run Zens or 20, and you're probably still going to just have that 5% damage increase, meaning that a lot of trials and sometimes even 4-man content like to run Zens, because you're basically getting a free 5% damage increase on top of whatever you have on top of them. This is how sometimes you find unnamed buffs that you apply to enemies, but notably you can't restack them even if they're not being applied to yourself like a buff. This brings us into our next concept for DPS sets for PvE content, which is that sometimes good damage is just good damage. You see this with sets like Pillar of Nirn, but a better example in the current meta is Depths of Whirl. When you apply a light attack, you apply a Whirl of Depths to a target, dealing 5,376 frost damage over 8 seconds. When this effect ends, a 5-meter whirlpool is created under the target for 6 seconds and deals additional 3,806 frost damage for 1 second, and this effect can occur once every 18 seconds and scales off your weapon or spell damage. And this is a perfect example of sometimes just higher numbers of DPS are good. Just building in crit chance and crit damage and normal damage isn't all that it's made out to be for DPS. Sometimes you just want to have effect like these that deal tons of damage. In fact, we just talked about Veildrith in the Golden Vendor yesterday, which does really good AoE damage. It does 10k pop damage to the enemies around you. They could potentially get hit by multiple different disease spores. I mean, that's just overall potentially good value for damage. And the final set that I want to use as an example for DPS PvE content is Deadly. Now, a lot of people know that Deadly is good for PvP content, but why is it good for PvE content? Well, increase the damage of your damage over time and channeled attacks do by 15%, meaning that you can deal 15% more damage with those abilities. And notably, this had to be nerfed from 20% because it was too overpowered at that rate. And some would say that it's still overpowered at 15%. I just wanted to point this out because this is a percent increase that will stack with all the other things that you've got going on. All those buffs that you're getting from other people, all those buffs that you're creating with yourself by dealing increased crit damage. Well, let's say you slapped on Order's Wrath and then you slapped on Deadly. Well, the crit damage increase is now going to go with that 15% increase. Oftentimes, your PvE content for DPS is just about dealing as much damage as humanly possible. Usually you can go online and see what people are parsing and copy those builds, because at the end of the day, if you can hit a trial dummy for that, you can hit a real dummy for that same amount, which by dummy I mean trial boss, because at the end of the day, most trial bosses just get turned slightly to the left while everybody just sits there and does flanking damage to them. And your only goal is to deal as much damage as possible. And that's why I wanted to use these sets as the example to highlight, is because these are great sets to use. But I want to give one more example that you could use if you're not interested in a mythic. And then we're going to talk about a mythic as well that is also utilized and break down why it's good and not good at the same time. The monster set that I want to break down for you is Zons. When you deal a critical damage with a light or heavy attack, you have a 33% chance to tether yourself to the enemy for 10 seconds. And as long as you remain within 8 meters of them, about 15 feet, you will deal 145 flame damage every second, and increasing by 100% per tick. And they're afflicted by the burning status. This can occur once every 20 seconds and scales off your weapon or spell damage. So notably, you hit somebody with light or heavy attack, you cause this burning beam to go between the both of you. Only they get burned, don't worry. And it essentially increases drastically as it goes. This is a great PvE set, but this is why Zons is not really used as much for PvP, because it used to be. But you can see that if I just walk 15 feet away from you, which is notably just like three shortish people stacked on the ground, the effect will end, and that's not something you want to easily be as counterable. But a trial dummy is just going to sit there, and trial dummies also translate to trial bosses because oftentimes they're just sitting there taking it. And so Zons is great for that, but not always great for PvP. But notably, some people do use sets like Zons for PvP, but it's not as often. Usually you see them more in like stun builds, where people basically get trapped, knocked down, and then they're getting Zons and they don't have time to get up. But in a mobility-esque meta that we have right now where sorcerers reign supreme, one streak to teleport away and your Zon's effect was wasted, which means you get two pieces doing pretty much nothing. Next, let's talk about the Harpooner's Kilt, one of the most sought after mythics for PvE if you don't include Oaken Soul, which still does get used quite often. Dealing direct damage grants you a stack of Hero's Focus for 20 seconds, up to 10 stacks maximum. You can only gain one stack of Hunter's Focus per second. Each stack of Hunter's Focus increases your crit chance by 110 and increases your crit damage by 1%. Taking damage, however, removes 5 stacks of Hunter's Focus up to once per second. Removing the Harpooner's Weight and Kilt also removes these stacks. So you might be thinking, wow, this is a great mythic. And it is. This is one of the most popular mythics for PvE content in the game. So why is it not always good? And why is it not used for solo? Well, if you're a solo player, you may have this problem where you get attacked and then you lose all of your effects. And that can be pretty detrimental because every time you're hit, you lose the effect of what you should be getting. That notably can cause some problems because now essentially your mythic isn't doing anything, which means instead of wearing a nice little monster set, you are getting the effect of nothing, of a cool pair of pants that took you very long to get because Thieves Guild troves suck. So it's important to recognize the type of content that you're doing. If you find yourself doing Infinite Archive arenas, if you find yourself doing 4-man content that requires you to constantly take tick damage or any type of damage, you probably want to make sure that you're thinking about what PvE sets are you wearing. That's why oftentimes 4-man content builds slightly differ from trial builds, because sometimes you're going to be taking a bit more damage in 4-man content, especially there's different hard modes and different mechanics that may be inside of each dungeon, and oftentimes Harpooner's Weight and Kilt, which can be great for trials, is absolutely horrid for dungeons, and definitely for Infinite Archive. And now we're ready to talk about PvE support, which notably, oftentimes people think that healing and tanking are two separate things, and to some extent they definitely are, but oftentimes what they try to do with their sets can sometimes be very similar. For example, sometimes tanks need to build a bunch of armor, resistances, and other things to keep themselves alive, but oftentimes you'll find themselves wearing support-esque sets, which we're going to break down. But notably, healers do the same thing as well. Oftentimes, you don't need to wear tons of healing sets. Yes, there are so many good healing sets that exist these days, but oftentimes you're going to find yourself giving buffs to players more then you're probably going to find yourself healing them. And let's first talk about Spell Power Cure. This drops from White Gold Tower. When you overheal yourself or an ally, you give the target Major Courage for 5 seconds, which increases their weapon and spell damage by 430. This is important to kind of remember too that this is a named buff, but we also need to remember too that not all buffs are created equal. Some buffs you get just by activating a Mage's Guild ability or having a certain ability on your bar, or maybe wearing an easy set to get. Things like Major Courage can definitely be a little bit more difficult to get, so notably it's important to note that not all buffs are created equal. And ones like Spell Power Cure, as you can see, they don't notably give you, bonus healing or all these other things. It's a buff essentially to damage output. Another somewhat example of this, but I want to give an example of one that also includes some other things as well. This is Hollowfang's Thirst, one of the most annoying sets to get in the game because it comes from Moongrave Fane, which is not a very fast dungeon. But whenever you critically heal or critically damage a target, you spawn a ball of hemoglobin at the location. After 2 seconds, the ball explodes, restoring magicka and applying minor vitality to you and your group within 6 meters of the ball for 9 seconds. This also increases their healing received in a damage shield strength by 6%. This could occur once every 9 seconds. So you can see here, yes, there is a bit of a healing component to this, kind of in a roundabout way. But you'll know too that you're giving people back some of their resources, which especially for things like tanks, which can definitely run low on resources, or even your DPS. This is another way that we can support players with our sets and not just do 20 million gigafarts of healing done in a 5-meter radius. That's not always important for a healer. And another quick example of this is Grand Rejuvenation, which comes from Dragonstar Arena as a 2-piece weapon. The initial heal of Grand Rejuvenation invigorates you and group members affected for 6 seconds, restoring 224 magicka and stamina every 2 seconds. So you can see even just the 2-piece arena weapons are not always focused just on healing. Oftentimes they can be focused on things such as sustain. But it's not just healers that also like to do things other than heal. Tanks are also in the same page. For example, from Shipwright's Regret, we have Turning Tide. When you block, you gain Flowing Water for 10 seconds, causing your next bash attack to deal 2,223 magic damage to up to 6 enemies in a 5 by 10 meter line, and you apply Major Vulnerability for 10 seconds, increasing their damage taken by 10%. This is a perfect example of everything we've encapsulated so far, also including tanks, which notably now are debuffing the enemies that we're fighting. And you can see that here as well with the Cloud Rest set, Vestments of Olorime. Adds magicka to yourself, but also casting abilities that leave an effect on the ground in combat will create a circle of might for 5 seconds. You and your group members in the circle all gain Major Courage for 20 seconds. It's important to remember that if you're gaining Major Courage from another set, that this set is actually not going to pair well, and that's why oftentimes you see trials and dungeons kind of do some bit of brainstorming. What are you wearing? This is what we need. We need somebody to be wearing this set. For example, we talked about Zens earlier. It's important to have one of those, but you don't need two. That's a great example of how a healing and a tank set can overlap, and you may want to make sure that you don't have a few people wearing this set or a set like it. Another set that's so popular for both tanks and potentially even healers is Powerful Assault. It's so popular they had to nerf how hard it was to get. When you cast an assault ability while in combat, you and up to 5 group members within a 12-meter radius gain 307 weapon and spell damage for 15 seconds. It's great because it's unnamed. It applies to you and up to 5 group members, and also this can actually be used as a support set for both PvP content as well, which is a perfect segue. Why are some of these support sets not used for PvP? What's the difference? And the difference for PvP is that generally you are working on your own, but that's not always the case. Oftentimes you may run into what's called a ball group. A ball group is a group of people in a group together who all run sets that pair well together, and notably probably include some of the very support sets that we've talked about for PvE content. Because they have so many extra players that they can count on to wear specific sets and to share buffs around, they don't have to worry about getting buffs and other things from other places, which would come from their 5-piece sets, their 2-piece sets, or from their mythic. But most PvP players oftentimes run jack of all trades where you have enough health, you have enough damage output, because you don't want to kind of become somebody who's group reliant. Because if you are in a ball group and you get separated, well, oftentimes you're very limited to what you were trying to do. And that's why oftentimes there can be a bit of a dichotomy between ball group sets and normal sets. So this is going to be more focused on the solo sets, whether there is a solo healer set or a solo PvP set for most people who just want to do generic DPS output. That's what we're going to break down next. And this is a great time to actually look at your attributes and your stats. I know it's crazy that we've gone pretty much the whole video without looking at your actual attributes and character sheet, but there's a reason for that. Generally, when you're inside of a group or you're inside of a specific role, you don't need to worry about all the other resources. For example, the odds of you running out of resources inside of a trial are significantly less than you are running inside of a PvP situation. Therefore, things like magicka recovery, stamina recovery are not as important. The other thing too is you're probably not dodge rolling and sprinting and blocking as much as a magicka character inside of a trial. These are things that we need to now break down as a PvP character, and that's why we are starting here. The other thing that people don't know is that increasing your match magicka also increases the amount of damage that you do, and it also determines how much healing in your shields are. This is very important because if you're a PvP class that likes to use shields, like a sorcerer, you want to make sure that you have a lot of magicka. Your health also can affect things such as your shield abilities. Stamina also, as it says here, roll blocking, dodging, doing all sorts of other things, and it can also be important if you have low magicka because it can increase the amount of damage that you do. Spell damage and weapon damage are also obviously important to note as well, and definitely notable because these also determine how much damage you're doing. Penetration is also important as well, depending on the type of build that you're using for PvP. I would say you usually want to have at least 7 to 8,000 minimum penetration. Your spell and physical resistances can be a bit all over the place, but I would say you at least want to have 1200 crit resistance at a minimum. Your magicka, health, and stamina recoveries are all going to be dependent on you and your playstyle, so that's going to be a bit varied. But let's talk about why my stats aren't necessarily as good right now, and let's talk about some ways that you really want to might be more stat focused and how you can use that to then determine, is a set actually good for me? For example, the first one we're going to start with is Roxas, which each time you're in combat, you gain a stack of Dark Light. Each stack of Dark Light increases your stamina recovery, magicka recovery, and health recovery by 8, and it stacks up to 30 times. This can give us tons of extra recoveries. Notably, that's not necessarily as important for any other type of content, but it is good for PvP because guess what? Now we can have enough resources to basically stay in the fight longer. I always say that there's 3 ways to kill an enemy player. You can either surprise them by coming out of stealth or hitting them when they're not paying attention, or stack all sorts of catapults and lancers on top of them. The second one is you can burst them, which a lot of times people confuse for surprising, but burst damage may be all of your procs line up. You make sure everything goes off at once, and you were hitting for 10 to 20% of your health. Now you're hitting for 30 to 40. They're taken off guard. They don't know that they need to heal and give themselves a damage shield. Now they're dead. The third thing is you can get into a bit of a war of attrition with them. You can make them run out of resources, and if they've got no resources to cast abilities, well, they're dead. Other things to consider are like my favorite mythic, which increases your max stamina, health, and magicka the longer you're in combat. So I may not have all of the health and things that I may want right now, but because I am able to over time build these stats up and get myself to 33,000 health and over 250 plus thousand magicka, I'm pretty confident in my shields and ability to survive. So these are things that you generally won't really talk about in any other types of content, but are definitely notable now. But going along with some of the other concepts that we talked about, I said we want to make sure that we have at least 8,000 penetration minimum. Here's another way that we could get it. When you deal damage to an enemy who's off balance, your offensive penetration is increased by 4,632. Notably, that gets to about 5,312 if it's golded out. That's a great way to get there. So oftentimes, PvP is just a situation where you want to have a good bit of health, you want to have a good bit of recovery, you want to have a good bit of other resources, you want to have the ability to have some good penetration, and you want to have the ability to have some good weapon and spell damage. Or if you can't have good weapon and spell damage, you want tons of either magicka or stamina, because that will also work to increase your total damage output. But there are other good sets too, like Rallying Cry, which notably are a pretty popular proc set. While Battle Spirit is active, which just means, hey, you're in Cyrodiil or Battlegrounds or in a duel, critically healing yourself or an ally causes you and up to 11 other group members within 12 meters gain 300 weapon and spell damage and 1650 crit resistance for 20 seconds. Each group member affected reduces this effect, however, by 15 weapon and spell damage and 83 crit resistance. So notably, you give yourself and essentially people around you tons of buffs. It's actually better if you use this alone, and you can see 300 weapon and spell damage is nothing to scoff at, but notably, 1650 crit resistance is a lot. In fact, that's almost more than you can build if all of your pieces were impen. Now, we're not going to go into traits in this video because that's irrelevant to whether a 5-piece set is good or not, but it's just important to kind of break down that yes, there are other ways that you can gain these things, such as through traits and other things, enchantments, and all sorts of other goodies. So don't just think your 5-piece set is going to carry you to 30 plus K health. Obviously, you can slap on some health enchants, you can change your attributes around, you can change your Mundus Stone around, for heaven's sakes. But importantly, a lot of times what you can't get through a lot of times enchantments and things, you can't get tons of weapon and spell damage. You can only get a mediocre amount of penetration. And it's important to remember that as you build your character. Oftentimes, too, your race can be important. And if you're in a situation where you have a good loadout for PvP, sometimes it's better to just stick with that loadout if you know that it works and continue to try it. I see so many people changing loadouts all throughout, Cyrodiil. Every time they go into a battleground, they do really well with it. Then their elo goes up. They go against somebody that's significantly better. Then they think their loadout's terrible. It's not true. And don't feel like you can't make minor tweaks. Don't just throw away whole builds. If you want to copy builds, I'm going to use this video to put tons of links below as to really good resources for Update 43 as to good tanking, healing, DPS sets, PvP loadouts. But again, I just want to reiterate that we took one of the most cattywampus builds, which you're looking at right now. This is the most cattywampus build. This is a 1-button build that we took into Cyrodiil. And we were actually, getting kills with it. So if you can get kills with a 1-button build, I have faith that you can get and do well if you just practice with a normal type of build. And the reason that I mention that is I know tons of people who just never want to change anything. And when we were looking and using the website to design our 1-button build, I said, well, I only have access to a Breton, so we're going to have to make a Breton work. We changed some other things around because Bretons get certain other types of bonuses that the actual race that we wanted to use initially didn't have. And we worked around it because oftentimes your racial bonus is just a bonus that you normally would get through some enchantment or some 1-piece set. We just swapped some things around, and it was that simple. But everyone, thank you guys so much again for watching. I know this was tons of concepts put into a very long video, and obviously when we do our individual meta report breakdown for the best solo sets, the best PvE sets, and the best PvP sets, there'll be more of a breakdown as to the specifics of what's good right now in this individual patch. But I hope this was insightful as to you looking at a brand new set, because I think we're at, like 650 sets in the game. I want you guys to be able to look at a set and think, could I build this into something that I wanted to use? Because there are so many ways that you can, and I hope that this kind of got the brain juices of flowing and knowing, hey, if I want to use a heavy attack build, maybe I want to pair it with a set like this. Maybe I want to use this monster set. Maybe I'm already getting this buff from this passive, so I'm going to get this set instead because I'm going to get this buff instead. So I hope this was helpful. If not, check out the meta report, which we will have coming soon, that will give you the specifics of here's what everybody's using, here's what's fantabulous, and then you can always copy that, because guess what? I'm guilty of that too. Sometimes I like to just copy what other people are using and see, hey, is this the best in slot thing? I'm also guilty of doing that in TCG games as well. Like, just give me the best winning deck with the best winning percentage, and I'll just go with that. And if you want that, that'll be in the upcoming videos. I just want to thank you guys again for watching. And as always, we're doing our 3 giveaway drawings. All you have to do is leave a comment in the comments below. Tell me what was helpful. Tell me what other information you have for new players or returning players or any sort of other additional helpful tips that you can give in the comments. Second thing is, look for a hidden word to be flashed upon the screen throughout a random video posted this month. If you're the first person to comment that word, you will win. And the third thing is just make sure you're subscribed. Just be subscribed on YouTube. And if you want 2 additional entries for that third drawing, just follow on Twitch and Twitter. Thank you guys so much again for watching, and I'll catch you later. Bye, guys.
You better remember to like and subscribe to Jakeclips. Or you should. I might have to pluck your eyes if you don't. Or, better yet, I'll skip rope with your entrails. Do it now. Subscribe. Ta-ta. Off with you.